Hey guys! There are a ton of places where typography is very important in your comic, so you do kind of need to learn a little bit about it. So here we go. Yeah, it shows up in a lot of places. It shows up in your logo for your comic, your speech bubbles, sound effects, and in any print material you do, including like the back cover of your comic where the synopsis sits, internal pages of your comic for if you have, say, like a dedication or an author's note or something. There's lots of little typography things that you need to keep in mind. So I guess I will go into all these examples and kind of break down what you need to keep in mind, and then some best practices with typography if you don't know what you're doing. Because typography is its whole own art, and I know the basics because I use them at my graphic design job and in my comics, but I by no means am an expert on typography, and there are lots of people who are much better at it than I am. I envy those people who can do beautiful hand-lettered fonts. You are amazing, and teach me your ways. So, okay, first off, your logo or your title for your comic. So, your comic should probably have a logo. And honestly, that can just be like a font with your title. Like, that's it. That can just be that. That's totally fine. It can be handwritten. You can grab a pre-made font. You can draw it out entirely if it's, you can have a logo that has like a picture aspect to it as well as like the typography aspect. There's lots of stuff you can do, but your comic will definitely need one for branding purposes. Your logo is probably going to go on everything. It's going to go on the front of your comic. It's going to go on any advertising you put out, any marketing you put out. It is the brand of the comic. It's very important. So a lot of thought should go into it, but also, if you don't know what you're doing, just put together something simple. That's it. So yeah, like I said, you can either do handwritten stuff, but that can be very intimidating when you're first starting. What I did with my first comics was I took a pre-existing font and I drew on top of it and then customized it from there, just because I was not very confident in making beautiful, like, consistent hand-drawn letters. So that is totally fine if you need to trace it at first and then make it your own from there. But you can also just grab a font that is already pre-made and you can slap some elements on top, or you can just play around with colors and strokes and stuff. It's up to you. You can mix your fonts with some drawn elements like stars or vines or whatever makes sense for your comic. You can put your lettering on top of silhouettes. You can decorate the insides of your fonts. You can add textures, whatever it is. One thing I did for 9 Point is I just grabbed a pre-existing font and I threw some stars on top and played around with the sizing of the words and letters. So it's up to you. You can go as simple or as complicated as you want. I just make sure that you are decorating it in the style of the genre your comic is in. So for example, if you're doing, say, a fantasy comic, there's typical fonts that are used for fantasy. If you look at fantasy comics or fantasy novels, there tends to be like a certain style to it. Like a lot of the time it can look very like serif-y. It might look like, that text, that font style that's like, it looks like an old manuscript from like the medieval ages. You can use that kind of idea. Though it depends on the flavor of fantasy you're working in. Whereas something like, maybe like a cute slice of life about like, I don't know, some cute kids going to high school and having high school problems, you might want to use like a cute little bubbly font or something like that. And obviously incorporate elements from the genre. So if you're doing a fantasy about plants, you can add some plants into your font or your logo. And if you're not sure where to start, go grab some references of comics or stories or movies that are all in your genre and see what they do and get some inspiration from there. And when you're working on your logo, obviously do lots of drafts and ideas to figure out what you want to do and to find what feels right. Do lots of iterations on it. Make sure it's readable but unique. Make sure it shows off the tone and genre. Draw it out a lot before you pick your final one. But honestly, if it's keeping you up at night and it's super stressful, just pick whatever looks the best. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can always rebrand later, so try your best. I think that one's one of the hardest, pieces of typography. I always struggle with my logos. But as long as it's unique, you're good. It especially helps if your title is very unique in itself. Like it doesn't share a name with any other works. So that's a good place to start. Anyways, moving on to speech bubbles. I already covered a little bit of this in my speech bubble video recently, but I'll go over it again just because it's nice to see this all laid out together. I'd recommend with your speech bubbles, so any of the dialogue inside your comic, make sure you're using a comic font. You can find lots of them on Blambot, lots of free ones to download. Typically, comic fonts tend to be sans serif. They tend to be all caps. They tend to be pretty readable in small paragraphs. And in your speech bubbles, they tend to be center aligned to fit the container of a circle, though if your speech bubbles are a different shape, obviously make the font or the text fit the shape that they're in. And I'd also recommend with your speech bubbles, stick to one font size, one readable font size as your default. So whenever characters are talking, maybe stick to like or 12 point or 12 pixel size font. I think the lowest you can go is like 10 points. 14 points might be too big depending on what you're doing. It depends on how readable you want it to be, but 12 points is like a pretty good starting point. So pick one size that's like readable. You use it for pretty much everything until you have a character say shouting, or you want emphasis on a word or a sentence. You can make the fonts bigger. And if it's, say a character whispering or like a little side note, like an aside thing, you can make the font a bit smaller. But definitely make sure that your default, what you're using for most things, is consistent and that it is large enough that people can read it. Probably honestly better to go bigger than it is to go smaller, just for the legibility. And if you plan to handwrite your speech bubbles, make sure it's legible. Show it to a friend, see if they can read it. If you're not super confident in keeping it legible and consistent, you can always do what I did with the logos and also just draw on top of a pre-made font. That way you can add your own kind of handwritten flair while also having a nice guide underneath. Moving on to sound effects. Sound effects are cool. They're really fun. There's lots of fun stuff you can do with them because you can integrate them into your panels. You can put them in the background. You can wrap them around objects or characters. You can style them so that they look like the sound they're making. So for example, say you have like a slimy, gross monster like crawling across the ground. You can make the sound of it moving, like you can make the word of that like drip with little slime drips. That's really cool and fun. And again, sound effects, you can either hand letter them, which is what I do for a lot of them, just because I really like that kind of making them all unique and decorating them and integrating them in with the background. But you can also use pre-made fonts. Again, Blambot has a lot of really fun sound effect fonts that come in a whole bunch of different styles to fit a whole bunch of different sound effects. One thing I'd say is I'd recommend using sound effects kind of sparingly, or at least understand why you're using each one of them. In my first comic, I definitely put in a few too many at the beginning, and it just got kind of overwhelming, and I didn't need sound effects for all the things that I applied it to. So I'd recommend when you're adding a sound effect, make sure that it's necessary to understand the action, or it's necessary for, say, humor purposes, or atmosphere purposes, or something like that. Don't give every little single thing a sound effect, because eventually they'll just blend into the background and be boring, or it'll clutter up your page. So just use them sparingly, understand why you're using them. And again, you can always draw over top of a font if you need a base to customize off of. So the final place where I think you'll probably run into lots of typography in your comics is if, say, I usually run into it when I'm working on a print book and I have interior pages, or like the backside of the book where it has like the summary and the blurb. So there's going to be body text, so paragraphs and stuff, where it needs to be legible. Your font for this kind of stuff can be different than, say, your speech bubble font. Just because the font that I tend to use for speech bubbles, it doesn't work great in large paragraphs. It's kind of hard to read. It's meant for small little snippets inside speech bubbles. So I'd recommend looking into fonts that look nice in paragraphs. And honestly, you can go with a serif font like Georgia or something, or you could go with a sans serif like Helvetica or Arial or something. Definitely stay away from Comic Sans or Times New Roman. A lot of people don't like them. They're kind of boring, but you do you. But yeah, make sure that if you have text in a large paragraph, make sure that it's legible, and play around with sizing. Again, for all of your paragraphs, you'll want like a legible, like one font size. Again, you could probably go with like 12-point font in whatever you've chosen. And then if you need, say, like a heading or a title on top, I'd recommend using a larger size or pairing it with like one other font or something like that. Don't go crazy with having like 7 different fonts within a page or within a book. Sticking to one is easy because then you can just denote like headings and captions and stuff by changing the size or maybe making it bold or italic. But if you really want, you can add maybe 1 or 2 other fonts to kind of add a little variety. Definitely look into your typography fundamentals before playing around with it too much. You're always safest going with one font and sticking to it. So that covers, I guess, like all the use cases. But here's my final little tips on how to keep your typography really nice and tippy toppers. I wrote tippy toppers in my notes, so here we go. So number 1, make sure that it's legible. Make sure that your line height, so the space between each line of text, make sure that you don't have so much space that they don't look like they belong together if it's, say, a paragraph or within a speech bubble. Don't make it so tight that it's hard to figure out which line you're reading on because they all look so bunched together. If you're working in like Photoshop, there's lots of like, it'll auto size kind of your line height, so don't worry about it there too much. But additionally, make sure that your fonts are easy to read. Don't pick fonts that are impossible. I think this happens more when people do like handwritten fonts, but make sure that it's legible, test it with people, ask them like, what does this say? And if everyone tells you it's gobbledygook, then you really need to go get like a nice, readable, legible font. And make sure there's high contrast. The best recommendation is having black letters on a white background or white letters on a black background. If you plan to use color, make sure they're as close to that as possible. You don't want your colors to look almost the same in value because then it's going to be really hard to read and people aren't going to want to read it. So make sure you got that good contrast level. Number 2, I mentioned this before, but limit the amount of fonts you use. Don't grab 70 million fonts. It'll make things hard to read. It'll be frustrating. It won't look cohesive. It's like if you did a comic where every single panel had a totally different style, you'd just be kind of thrown off and confused probably. And it would take a lot more effort than just having one nice styled font. So keep things consistent. Also, people will probably tack meaning onto different font choices. So if you keep something as a default, people will eventually gloss over it and just read it and not care about how it looks. But if you want something to stand out, use a different font because it'll draw attention to itself. So there you go. That's a tool in your toolbox, I guess. Keep in mind hierarchy. Hierarchy just means the importance level of what you're reading. My best example of this is if, say, you're reading like a newspaper, the headline is usually really big to denote that it is the headline and it's encasing all of the body paragraph below it, whereas like the body text, the actual article is usually smaller font size, it's one size, and it's formatted into a paragraph. So the headline, because it's bigger and bolder, it's higher up in the hierarchy, whereas the body text is lower. And there's lots of levels to it. You can do some research into that very easily just by looking at like typography and hierarchy. But it's just something to keep in mind. If you use bigger fonts or bolds, people are going to look at that first. Again, keep things consistent so that people aren't getting confused on what to read first or where to look or what's attached to what. And I guess keep your alignment consistent. If all your speech bubbles are center aligned, it's going to be weird if you suddenly have a speech bubble that is left aligned. So keep it consistent. Keep it in mind. Make sure it's readable and understandable. And if you're not sure, if it is, show it to someone and get their feedback. Oh wait, not finally. Second to last. Don't stretch or squish your fonts. Don't take a pre-made font and like squash it down or like stretch it out like horizontally or vertically. It looks bad. Fonts are built to be balanced, and stretching them makes them hard to read. The exception might be a sound effect, but in that case, I think you're better off making a custom, like, handwritten thing, because then you can ensure it's readable and make sure the emphasis is in the right place. It's just bad practice to stretch and squish stuff. And finally, number 5, make sure that you are using fonts that you're legally allowed to use. You probably won't have, like, police coming and knocking down your door, but people who create fonts are artists and they do deserve credit, and don't steal their fonts. If you need to buy a license to use them commercially, make sure you do that. If that's something you just can't have right now, or you can't afford to buy fonts, make sure that you are using fonts that are free to use for commercial work. They'll usually say them wherever you download these fonts. They'll say it if it's free or if it's free for commercial use. That's very important to keep an eye on. Respect those font artists. They do lots of good, lovely work for us. So yeah, keep an eye on that, you silly artists. So there you go. That's it. That's all I got on typography. It's a very big topic. I hope I did it justice. There's a lot to it. This was just kind of like an overview of things to keep in mind. I'd recommend going and looking into typography, looking at the fundamentals of it. I could do many videos on typography, but I'm not super confident in it, so I wouldn't want to lead you astray by giving you the wrong information. So maybe in the future I'll do a longer one, but for now, this is all I got. I'm sorry. So honestly, as long as you keep your typography, like, legible and simple and easy to read, you're fine. That's like the bare minimum, so just focus on that if you're not sure where to go. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.